All right, we say that we want to build our very first portfolio using Vue.js. So let's go back to our project's example and use it to learn how to use the before directive to output each project of an array onto the page. For our next task, it will be useful if we could use a loop, and the before directive is here to help with that. So its syntax has not much in common with a classic for loop in JavaScript, but more with a foreign loop in either Python or JavaScript. So it is used to iterate over object, the foreign, in JavaScript. So with this directive, we can specify between quotes the elements of the array and single element using the syntax project in project, for example, where the project's property is our property, it's our project property inside the data object of the Vue instance, and which contains an array of objects, and so each project is a single element of the array, so it is a single object. We can call these anything we like, but the thing is to keep in mind that everything that follows the in keyword must be an iterable from our data object, while what comes before can be anything we like. I mean, we can write any keyword we want here to represent the single element of the iterable. Of course, we need to always to remember that we need to make our code readable. So it is useful to use something that clearly describe the single element of the iterable. So in our case, the user project as the variable seems quite fine because it's the most appropriate choice since we have an array of projects. So let's move to the to our JavaScript file and write some code. I'll do it in a second. So back to VS Code, let me create a new file, HTML, and let me create a new main.js file. And let me actually copy wherever I had in the previous file and move it in here, and this is the loops. So we can delete all that, we don't need it anymore, and we can write our Vue instance like that. And we can delete everything we don't need, so this bit is useless for us. We can delete this and leave a plain Vue instance with just the element and the data object and the methods object. So now what we are going to do is let's think first what we want to do. So let's create, we said that we want to iterate over an array of projects, so let's create them. So let's create the projects, lower cases, projects, projects property, which is an array of objects. And for now, simply we will type title property for the object and say, I don't know, Twitter, let's say portfolio. And then languages could be an array of strings like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, I don't know, Vue.js, of course. Okay, let's copy a couple more times and say Twitter clone. Let's say, let's keep the same values here, we need to remember to separate each element of the array with a comma. We could, I don't know, blog and the commerce. Okay, something like that we have. That's fine. You can put in here wherever you want. It doesn't matter for the purpose of our demo. It is fine, everything you write. Okay, so we have an array. We have an array of objects, and each object has a couple of properties. So let's see what we need to put inside our array. Let's add also it is our portfolio. So we have a name. Could say John Doe, and we have a title, which is simply portfolio. Okay, so just cover a few more properties, and we will use them to render something onto the page. And we keep seeing shining because we have to refresh the connection and open a new live server connection. And sure enough, we have nothing to show because we have not yet rendered anything onto the page. So the first thing is to say, I don't know, h1, and we can say the name, and we can say the, what was the other thing, title. And we can concatenate this with a space like that. And of course we have John Doe portfolio, so it is working fine. And oops, now we said that in this section we are going to use the v-for directive to loop over the projects array. So we are using a loop actually. So let's put everything inside the non-ordered list, and then in the list item, on the list item, we will use this directive, this new directive v-for. So what we are saying is that we want to loop over the array. So the array is projects, and for each project, so for each project in the projects array, so for each project in the projects array, we want to see what? We want to see, for now, just the project title. So we access the title property of this object using the dot notation, and we show all projects that we have in the array, all the title of the project that we have in the array inside this list. So let's review what we have done quickly, very quickly. So in the code here, so this bit of code, we first use the name and title properties to render the main title of our portfolio, so the name and the portfolio word itself. Then we use the v-for directive, and here we specified inside quotes here. So between these quotes, we specified our syntax, and we say that for each element of the project's array, we want a single element to be assigned to the project variable, and we use we use the v-for project in projects syntax. And now on each iteration, the project variable holds the single object from which we can retrieve its properties using the dot notation, like we did here on line 18. So project.title. Project here is an object, so we can access properties of an object using the dot notation. And one thing to note is that the v-for directive gives us also access to the index of the element at each iteration. So if we do something like v-for project, comma, index in projects, so project will hold the object and index will hold the position in the array of the current object. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, etc. We also have to note that when we are working with objects, Vue can show an alert to inform us that we need to use a key. So the use of a key is recommended. What this means is that it is expected a key identifier to identify each element or so when the code is rendered. This can be done using the key attribute and bind it to the instance. So for instance, to an ID property of the object or to a different property, like we could do something like that. Let's see in action. So we could say key equal to project dot id if we had an id here. So if we had an id here, id, we could do that. Okay, so this id represents the id of the project, and so the key is this one. Otherwise, we could, for now, we could use the index. So at each iteration, the project is 0, 1, 2, 3. We could use this index, so simply use index. Or we could, I don't know, like use the project title. I mean, wherever you want to identify this project. Usually you will add an ID to the object and use it to identify, so as a unique identifier. So let's move forward. So in case you don't want to use this, and in case, let's see if we got an error from the inspector. So without the ID or with the ID. Okay, so we don't even have anything that's shown here. So if we remove it for the array, I think it is pretty fine to use it without the ID, and it's fine, yes. So it is fine anyway. So if it's looping over an array of object, you don't have to use the key, but make sure always to check the documentation. So as I said, so the v-for can also be used to iterate over object. In such case, we have access to the value, the key, and also the index of the element. For instance, like so. So would be like v-for, and then in here we will have the project element. So the element, let's say just the syntax. The element, the key, and the index in object, where object is any object that you have in your Vue instance. And if you want to loop over its properties, you can use this syntax like that. So element can be any word you choose, key can be any word you choose, and index can be anything you choose, but of course keep always in mind to write code that is readable and has meaning. So that's pretty much it for loops. So let's now move to another important feature of Vue.js, that is how we can handle user inputs and events. I'll see you there.